afternoon. So the 4 p.m. slot is sometimes a little rough, so we're going to keep it exciting. I know that data privacy and security is the top of mind for me, and I know it is for a lot of companies these days. It's in the headlines almost every day, unfortunately. So today we have an amazing panel of experts here today to talk a little bit about their tips, as well as considerations to think about your own privacy programs and security programs. And so I'd like to first have the panel introduce themselves. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and what got you interested in this topic?
Okay, sure. So my name is Alex Hancock. I'm a data solutions architect for Simply Business, which is one of the leading small business insurance providers in the UK. We're currently making inroads into the US market, and we're definitely looking for a look at people, so hopefully this is the place to be and to chat to people. I was the data solutions lead on the GDPR program, and I basically represented data interests. And, yeah.
Okay, great.
Nice to see everyone again. I've probably talked to a few of you. So I'm Ryan Gurney. I head up security at Looker. Last year I joined, I was new to the company and so happy to be back to talk to you. I got into this topic basically by accident. I had an individual come speak to my school when I was in college and said that he did dumpster diving and all this other crazy stuff around security. And I said, I want to intern in that. And that's kind of how I got into security. And many years later, here I am, and glad to be here. And this is a great topic.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, I'm Barb Lawler, and I'm the Chief Privacy and Data Ethics Officer at Looker. I've been at Looker a couple of months officially, and I got into privacy and data protection from what's now considered kind of a non-traditional route, which is I worked in a variety of technology companies and always had a touch point around data, developing systems, business requirements for systems that were customer-facing and supported sales and marketing. And I took a job that nobody else wanted called privacy a long time ago at a great company called Hewlett-Packard. I was their first Chief Privacy Officer and then was also CPO at Intuit for a number of years. So excited to be here.
Great, thank you. So Barb, let's start with you. GDPR. That is something that we're all talking about, had to scramble earlier in the year to comply with. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is, and if you see also any other privacy laws coming into play here in the US?
GDPR is most commonly known as the EU General Data Protection Regulation. Some people have called it the gigantically difficult privacy rules. A few people have called it the great personal privacy rules, but GDPR is really taking what has been a very long-standing cultural position in the European Union that privacy is a fundamental human right. And so what does that mean? That means individual autonomy, how I make decisions about my own life, freedom from intrusion, in other words, who intrudes in my world or my home, and the ability to make decisions based on that. When we look at what's changed in the world of new technology and the amazing and fantastic ability to use data, the GDPR came into being kind of in response to that, to modernize what were some very old rules. So in short, the way to think about GDPR first and foremost is data governance. What GDPR is really after is the idea that organizations, companies, small or large, should know what data you have, where it came from, why you have it, how you're using it, how long you're going to keep it. So at a fundamental level, that is good end-to-end data governance. In spite of its 261 pages, which I read so that you don't have to, it also outlines rights that individuals have to access, correct, get a copy of, or request deletion of their data. It also has a number of requirements for organizations, again, going back to that data governance approach. And it's actually very risk management oriented, but essentially what it says is that organizations, again, have to document everything about that data governance and then be able to prove it. So for example, at Looker, we have to prove that to our customers or a regulator, if a regulator asks. So what has that influenced? Most recently, California passed the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, That's still being amended, both at the state level from a governor's perspective, and the legislature we expect to change it. But it's taken pieces of the GDPR and sort of plunked them into a non-cultural framework around privacy, but that will have some of the same individual rights that I just described under GDPR. We see other states perhaps copying that, and that's also driven the very high interest at the federal government level to actually create a national framework for privacy in the United States. And in fact, the Senate had hearings on that today.
Great, so we have something to look forward to in U.S. federal legislation.
More work.
Privacy. Wonderful. So Alex, in your business, how has GDPR affected you, and how did you go about implementing it?
Sure. So I remember maybe the back end of last year going through the regulation. We had our legal counsel sort of describe it to us, and I think the initial reaction was just pure panic. I mean, as data professionals, I think we spent most of our lives trying to gather as much data as possible and understanding, how to drive value from that. And really, we were looking into what could potentially be a black hole of data value destruction. So, I mean, I'm really glad to say that that didn't happen, and there was many reasons why that didn't happen. So I think we had quite a successful implementation of the regulation. So initially, what I initially thought was going to be a single sort of data-led initiative absolutely wasn't. It was a cross-functional initiative. We had representation from legal, marketing, HR, product, technology, data. It was every part of the business was represented. At one point, we had 40 people involved, and in a business of about 400, that's 10% of your entire business involved in some way. So that really helped get us over the line. The other thing that really helped was a real superstar data protection officer who understood the regulation. It's really it's a hard read, and there was a kind of a cultural alignment of values between the data protection officer and our business, and the pragmatic understanding of how to apply that regulation in such a way that customer rights were respected, but at the same time, business value wasn't destroyed at the same time. So that was a really important framework for us to start the program. From a pure practicality perspective on the data side, so the GDPR kind of splits down into three major areas. We have the data subject access requests, we have the right to be forgotten, and we have marketing consent. The first one of those is basically a customer can ask for all the data you hold about them, and of course that could be quite scary. So we went through a data discovery exercise and listed down all the data points and personally identified information across all of our systems and created a catalog of these systems. And then we created scripts that would be able to go down to all of our systems and pull those on demand. The critical thing we didn't do was build an all singing, all dancing DSAR system, which would have taken months. It's still quite ad hoc, and it still requires a little bit of massaging through the process. And that's actually been proven really successful because we haven't really had that many requests. We always operate on a kind of build minimum viable product and then iterate if we have to, because we don't want to invest too much. So that was successful. From the right to be forgotten perspective, this is where getting the business value of data right was really critical. We analyzed how the data that we collect about our customers drives value in our business, and we had a really deep dive, from a marketing perspective, from a sales conversion perspective, and we defined subsets of users in terms of categorize these kind of users. The data is not really valuable, and we can start purging it from our systems in this kind of way. So we got retention rights depending upon customer interactions with our systems. And that didn't effectively, that meant we could maintain a lot of the value of our customer database over time. So we're not always destroying that. The way that was practically implemented is that we have a schema registry, which, in terms of data governance, we have all the data points that we collect, which of those data points contain personally identifiable information, what type of PII that is, and then we have automated scripts that using those schema registries and the PII classification, we would then pseudonymize data appropriately to that data point, so that when we're doing our analysis and our machine learning, we can say, well, it's still consistent across the customer's journey. Finally, then on the marketing consent basis, we don't really have a very well modeled customer domain, unfortunately. I think many people might struggle with it across all the different interactions that we have across the prospect phase and the sales and service phases. So we kind of completely decoupled our implementation. We said, well, all of these systems can interface with a service that manages that customer's consent on the data point that they are providing consent for, and that service can then be integrated with any other system, and all the data is then fed back into our Looker models. We can check out the state of the health of the marketing database. So yeah, that's how we went.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you did a ton of work at Simply Business to implement it. And I know from our own experience at Looker, one of the things I noted in what you just said was it was a cross-functional effort, and same experience that we had at Looker when we were complying with GDPR. It was truly cross-functional, and one of the teams we worked closely with security. So Ryan, I'd be interested to know your perspective that GDPR had on security and how you think about privacy in a security compliance program.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that certainly we value and I value is transparency and building trust, right? And a lot of this around GDPR is really giving our consumers that level of trust. At the end of the day, it's a great thing. It's work, but it's a great thing. For us internally, when you think about GDPR, there's a number of security requirements that go along with GDPR, and Alex mentioned some of those things, but the tricky part is identifying all the data and the sprawl of the data that may occur. If you think about some of the systems and some of the cloud providers you may use, there is a lot of information to go gather, and you can't be successful unless you do have a cross-functional effort. And so the first part of that for us really was doing these data flows and working with product and saying, where does this data go? And how is it controlled, and what vendors might be touching that? And playing back the expectations to them that they have to meet a certain level of security reasonableness. But really it comes down to pseudonymization. I can't even say it.
Pseudonymization.
Thank you. Which really means you can take an approach with the data of tokenizing it or hashing that information. Another approach is you can encrypt that information, and that it really depends on whether you need to be able to pull back that information or not. In some cases, you may not need to, right? If you can take your data sprawl and tokenize information, then those tokens don't mean anything, right? That's not PII going through systems, and that's really the right way to approach that. The other side of that is understanding the systems that you own and what security controls you have to put on that. So that's another part of GDPR. You're supposed to take reasonable levels of security around technical controls, processes, and people. And when you think about those areas, you have to think first about access, not only in your application stack, but also on the back end, and really think about admin access. It needs to be tightened up all the way around, and hopefully the tools that you use help you do that. And then the other side of that is really around data breach notification, which is really having a capability to do incident response, right? And being able to monitor, would you know today if you had a data breach? And it's a pretty basic question, but there's a lot of companies or applications it's difficult to be able to say that. So, and then you unwrap all of that into what we like to call it's just risk management or risk assessment. And in the privacy world, I think they call it the privacy impact assessment, where it's ongoing, right? Because you as companies and us as Looker, we're going to continue to have other vendors and other places that data is going to go, and we have to stay in front of that. So you wrap that around by some policies and ongoing risk assessment.
Thank you. So data privacy and security is in the headlines almost every day, I think I mentioned. And so, started off with Cambridge Analytica, we saw Facebook, and now I think I saw Google in the headlines. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what do you think the future of privacy is and data ethics for companies? And Barb, I'd like to start with you.
I think the future goes to, Ryan, what you were saying a few moments ago, which is, what does it mean to be a trusted and trustworthy company? So what do those actions look like? So when we think about GDPR, and we talked about it in terms of knowing where your data is, having good data governance, we think about that for a minute, and that's not GDPR specific even. If you don't know where your data is, how do you know if you've had an incident or a breach? How do you respond to a user request to update their information, to correct or to delete their information? But those are very kind of organizational, procedural things. But as we think about the rapid expansion of the volume of data in the cloud and across many different applications and organizations, it's the potential and the future opportunities around data that we actually want to make sure that we're not tamping down too much, that we're not inhibiting, that there's not an opportunity cost because there's so many rules and regulations and procedures that actually prevent companies, organizations, research into new products, new capabilities, new things that benefit society, whether it's safety and transportation, whether it's increased health remedies through technology. And so when we think about the future of privacy and ethics is, what are the ethics that we actually weigh into what limits uses around data, which the GDPR kind of has a tendency to do, but what also enables uses of data in a way that has positive consequences for individuals or for groups. And so building that in is kind of the next step around privacy and data ethics. And that's where my role really fits, which is, again, you can do all the compliance and the documentation and review contracts and do training, but it's how do you evaluate those next steps of what new data innovations or data-driven innovations look like. And that's really the fun part.
Thanks, Barb. So Ryan, what do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting to see sometimes the millennials, how they treat their data. I have a 13-year-old son, and he's constantly wanting to put his data in all these places. And as a security professional, granted, it makes me a little uncomfortable. And so we have a lot of conversations about what you can post on Instagram. But from a business side, you know, we talked about transparency and trust and how important that is. I think one thing that's a challenge for a lot of companies is their vendors. And are your vendors honest? And are they upfront about their challenges that they may be facing? Do you hear from your vendors if they have a security or privacy challenge, right? One fun test to do is send an email, security at vendor name or privacy at vendor name, and see if you get a bounce back. Maybe they're not taking it as seriously as they should, right? And so it's important that if we think about the Cambridge Analytica situation, that application that was used to take that information, well, Facebook provided a pretty excessive API that application could use. From your own perspective and your own companies, think about your own APIs and are they restrictive from a security standpoint that the data only goes to those individuals where it's authorized? And then if you think about that case as well, if you go and look at the terms of service that this application as part of Cambridge had, it was pretty open. And how many here read terms of services, right? It talked about, hey, we can sell this data for commercial gain. So it's important that these things are there, and it takes time to manage them and have a team to actually manage these kind of things.
Alex, how about you?
Yeah, I guess I see two distinct streams as a data person. I mean, one is as a solutions provider. As we're creating new solutions or we're thinking about those, your minds go straight away to the impact assessment of PII straight away. I mean, beforehand, this actually really wouldn't factor into our considerations, interesting enough, I think, because we just got to a level of comfort with data, and all data is valuable. And straight away that some sort of designs will change, and the footprint of PII within your applications that you're developing or proposing needs to be looked at. The other thing is, you know, thinking about the full stack of the solution, and definitely, you know, as we're working with third parties, we're seeing differences in approach to the management of or responses to our questions about data privacy and data security. And that's now going to factor into architectural decisions, and in some cases, definitely wanting for more control. So I guess we feel most comfortable with having full control of data. So I think on an ongoing basis, that's going to be a competitive differentiator for service providers. Separately on the analyst slash data scientist perspective, I think we were enamored with the art of the possible. So we could use any data point to produce any analysis or any recommendation. And of course now straight away, as we're having those discussions, everything gets a little bit more tempered. And it's just about enthusiasm, because we're technical people, we see what we could do, and now we definitely have to bring that into our considerations.
Yeah, and I think, we have here an audience and entire place here full of customers that use data every day. And as we think about that, Barb, let me ask you, from a data ethics perspective, should companies be thinking about data ethics in part of their business and how they handle their customer data? I mean, where does ethics play into this?
I think one of the most challenging things about ethics is when we say, how should companies think about it, is that companies don't know how to think of it. What does data ethics even mean? So if I were to ask you to reflect, does your company have values on how you behave or how you operate? And most of the companies you work for probably have some kind of company values or culture articulated. So that's actually a good place to start in terms of thinking about ethics, which is not just what does a particular law or regulation or industry standards say, but what are the right things to do? And some of those are very values-based judgments. So if your company has values that it starts with, then you can start to articulate, well, what does that mean in practice? What does that mean on the ground? So Alex, I like the way you talked about it, because you didn't describe it as ethics, but you were talking about ethical approaches. And so one of the things to do is to start with, for example, what are those values? What are those translating into design, privacy by design, building that into your analyses, your products, your services. And then when you build to that, then you can test that along the way. A few moments ago when I was talking, one of the things that we're starting to see emerging, though, is, and again, out of Europe in particular leading the way, although our friends in Canada are also talking about this, and parts of Latin America as well, is this idea that companies should be collecting and using and reporting, creating new products based on data, considering ethics, which means starting with values, what's important to the company, but what's also important to society and the individuals. Because to me, at the end of the day, the ethic is that data came from somewhere. That what's behind that data, people, a person is behind that data point somewhere along the way. And so remembering the human component of whatever we're doing with data.
And if I could just piggyback on that, I think we do security awareness training internally, and I think our employees get tired of me saying a couple things, but it's important for them to hear it. One is, I feel like I work for the customer. But I also want to instill that in all our employees, that you work for the customer. And when we're designing or doing data architecture in your capacity, a very simple litmus test on ethics is, how would I feel if I was a customer and this situation was presenting itself, right?
So I completely concur. We just call it the WTF test.
Yeah.
Sometimes known as the Wall Street Journal test,
Yeah, we use that
or I
one.
suppose today pick a media outlet. But what's interesting, Tricia, you mentioned a moment ago, and I'll use this example, is sometimes there's actually a conflict between different policy or regulatory or business goals. And I actually think the Facebook situations recently are an example. And I'm not talking about Cambridge Analytica. I'm talking about the vulnerability that there was an issue with it patching that ultimately led to at least the belief that some 50 million users' accounts were exposed. And so what are one of the things that we're encouraged to do, that our colleagues in security, which I believe wholeheartedly in, is to use two-factor authentication. That typically involves providing a phone number, a mobile phone number. And what was that mobile phone number also being used for? For ad targeting. So when you give your phone number for two-factor authentication, which is clearly an important business outcome and security goal, do you expect that that's going to be used also to target ads at you? And I know what my answer is, but I'd be curious what your answer is. Ryan, I'm curious what you think about that.
No, I mean, that seems like a really bad idea because at the end of the day, if you're giving your phone number and you think for a second that's going to be used for marketing, are you going to pause before enabling something like two-factor authentication, which will protect your information and in fact protect another company, because an account takeover, which is what can happen if somebody's account gets, that's kind of the official term, gets taken over, are not cheap to handle. And so this concept is a little baffling to me, to be honest with you.
Sure. I mean, I think we're in a space where we apply data internally. So we have a product that's data oriented and we want to have a relationship with customers, but we don't actively share that data in any way. So the impact on us is less, and I think we try and be as respectful as we possibly can on the customer's wishes as they're interacting with us, and they'll only interact with us.
So I've been working in tech for 2 decades now, and I remember when privacy first started kind of coming in the forefront, and I would go to execs and talk about this, and it wasn't top of mind. And I've personally seen such a shift, not only internally, but with customers and vendors. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel, have you also seen that in your particular area, a shift in the last few years, and how is that impacting businesses in their day-to-day? So we'll start with Alex.
So I think the primary concern was, can we still apply the data in data-intensive ways for our core product? And basically the answer is yes. The regulation is clear on our industry, what we can do, and we can still apply our models in our core product of insurance. Otherwise we can't do business. The other side of things is just about, well, how do we interact with the customer, and how are we more respectful of their wishes? And that's definitely had an impact, and it affects how we approach our discussion, our initial courtship with our customers. So we want to try and provide you value, and if we do provide you value, can we get something in return? It's fine, you don't have to provide that, but we really like that. And it certainly has impacted our ability to make some deeper communications initially with the customers. But around this space, it's really important to iterate and not believe that just because you have one outcome when you've tried one thing to try and get value back from your customer, that's the be-all and end-all. And it's really, really important to iterate, basically, and do tests and understand what the customer wants to do and how best to do that.
How about you, Ryan?
I certainly have seen a difference. I'm a born worrier, so regardless, I'm chasing this stuff all the time. But where I've actually seen it a lot is in the questionnaires we get from customers, and how more the questions aren't as basic as they used to be, which I actually really appreciate, right? That helps us get that feedback and help us understand what you care about. I think in the early days, I was at eBay, and then I went to Zendesk, and now I'm at Looker. I get some questions like, do you have access control, right? Now I get questions around SAML and two-factor authentication and limiting admins and monitoring users, which is great. So I have seen a shift, for sure.
When I started in privacy, which has been quite a while ago, the person that I worked for at the time said, isn't that the little thing at the bottom of your website? What are you going to do with the rest of your day? And do you ever think you'll need more than one person besides yourself working on privacy? Now, that was a long time ago. There was no news every day. I can remember actually collecting news and tracking it and reporting it back out once a week or once a month. And now it's literally mainstream media every day. I think from a customer and a consumer perspective, over time, I've seen it actually move in waves. And so there's waves of compliance, and there's waves of innovation, and waves of compliance and waves of innovation. And what I mean by that is compliance driven by the latest new rule or requirement, and often more and more procedural, and certainly GDPR wins the procedural prize when it comes to privacy rules. But there are other older privacy rules that actually fit that same criteria. HIPAA, the Health Information Portability Act, actually has very similar procedural kind of requirements. In between, we saw data breach notification requirements across now all 50 United States. And those had its own set. But now what we see is much more consumer awareness, much more mainstream awareness in a very sophisticated way, and we've seen this in the news. And Ryan, what you said, when I first started working with Looker, we were focused on getting GDPR right. And now what we get is we get the same questionnaires on privacy, whereas before it was, do you have a privacy policy? Yes, check the box. Let me point you to our statement. And now it's, here's 20, 30, 40 questions that is, describe your privacy program, your detailed data uses, where it is, how it's used, why you have you considered all the different criteria? And it's often a companion that comes in with what Ryan's team gets, but what it says is that it's really important to our customers and their customers that we're getting privacy right and that we can actually explain it. And then I can use that in partnership with Tricia and Ryan and take that back to the organization and say, this is what our customers care about. This is what we should be doing next in terms of our products or services and how we talk about the product even early in the sales cycle.